The will was read on a Thursday afternoon. A small room. The family lawyer, Diana, sitting closest to the front, with the composure of someone who already knows what the document says. I noticed it before the reading began. Filed it. Said nothing. By the end of the 20 minutes, the room had changed. Everything had gone to Diana. Not her share. Everything. The house. The savings. The investments. The specific items grandmother had described to different family members as theirs when the time came. All of it. One name. I looked at Diana during the reading. The composure held. Not the composure of surprise being managed. The composure of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and is now inside it. I drove home that evening thinking about one thing. Not the money. The composure. And what it told me about how long this had been planned. But to understand what I found when I started looking, you need to know what the years before had looked like. My grandmother was one of those people who makes a family feel like a family. Not through authority, through presence. The specific quality of someone who holds a large extended network of people together simply by being the person everyone orients toward. Whose house is the house where things happen? Whose opinion carries weight without being imposed? Whose love is felt as something you can depend on rather than something you have to earn? She had been widowed in her 60s, had managed her own affairs for 20 years afterward with the particular independence of someone who had no intention of becoming a burden to anyone. Her financial position was comfortable, not extravagant, the result of a long life of careful management. A house that had appreciated significantly over decades. Savings built through consistency rather than risk. Investments that her late husband had established and that she had maintained with the same careful attention she brought to everything. She had spoken about the estate over the years. Not formally, in a natural way that a matriarch speaks about what she intends when she is gone. At family gatherings, in individual conversations. The specific way that a person who has thought carefully about what they want their legacy to look like communicates that thinking to the people who matter to them. She had been clear. The estate would be divided among her children and grandchildren. Not equally in every detail, but fairly, with specific items designated for specific people based on what she knew of each person's attachment to them. My grandfather's watch had been described to me since I was a teenager as mine when the time came. A piece of furniture she knew I had admired belonged to one of my cousins. Her jewelry was spoken about between her and my mother across years of conversation. None of it documented in the formal way a lawyer would document it. All of it communicated clearly enough that the family understood what her intentions were. Diana is 4 years older than me. We had always had the particular relationship of siblings who are different enough that closeness requires effort. Not antagonistic, just differently shaped. She had always been more focused on the practicalities of things, on what arrangements looked like, on who was positioned where in the family structure, on information, who had it and who didn't. I had noticed that quality over the years without attaching particular significance to it. Some people are simply more attuned to the social and logistical landscape of family life. The move to our grandmother's house was proposed about 3 years before her death. Grandmother had been managing well independently until a health event in her late 80s made it clear that some additional support would be beneficial. The family discussed it. Diana proposed moving in herself. Not temporarily, long-term. She presented it as the obvious practical solution. She worked flexibly, was geographically available, had the time and the capability. Nobody in the family had reason to question the offer. It looked like what it presented itself as. A granddaughter stepping up to provide care for an elderly woman who needed it. The kind of thing that deserves the respect it typically receives. I expressed gratitude along with everyone else. Visited as regularly as I could. Maintained my relationship with grandmother through calls and visits. For the first year, everything appeared to function as described. Grandmother seemed well cared for. Diana seemed genuinely committed to the arrangement. The family had the reassurance of knowing someone they trusted was present. Then small things started to change. Slowly, gradually, in ways I noted without connecting at the time. The first thing I noticed was the calls. Grandmother had always called family members regularly, not with agenda, just the ordinary contact of someone who stayed connected to the people she loved. Weekly calls with my mother that had been a fixture of both their lives for decades. Occasional calls to me that were warm and specific and contained the particular quality of her attention that I had valued my entire life. The frequency of those calls decreased about 18 months after Diana moved in. Not dramatically, gradually, the weekly calls to my mother becoming fortnightly, then monthly, then occasional, each reduction individually explainable. Grandmother was older, managing energy differently. Diana had mentioned that she tired more easily, that she needed more rest, that she had good days and less good days. The explanations were plausible. Age produces exactly the changes being described. My mother accepted them, adjusted her expectations, tried to be understanding about an elderly woman's changing capacity. I accepted them too, for a while. When I visited, the dynamic was different from what I had known before Diana moved in. Not obviously wrong, just different in the particular way of a household that has reorganized around a new person at its center. Diana was always present, not intrusively, just present, in the room or adjacent to it. Available in a way that had a quality I couldn't quite name at the time. The quality of someone who is managing an environment rather than simply living in it. Grandmother seemed well, happy to see me, engaged in our conversations. But there was something in those visits that I kept noticing and kept setting aside. A certain checking quality in her when Diana was nearby. The specific way she sometimes paused before answering a question, as if calibrating her response against something. I told myself it was the ordinary adjustment of someone in reduced health. That being cared for produces a kind of dependency that changes how a person moves through their interactions. That the grandmother I was seeing was the same person in a different phase of life. That what I was reading as checking was simply tiredness. I set it aside and visited again the following month, and noted the same thing again, and set it aside again. The information management became visible about 2 years in. I called Grandmother on a Tuesday afternoon. Got Diana, who said Grandmother was resting, who took a message. I called the following week. Same result. When I visited the following month, Grandmother mentioned she hadn't been sleeping well, had been more tired than usual. She didn't mention missing my calls. When I mentioned them, she seemed uncertain about whether she had received them. Diana, nearby, mentioned that she tried to protect Grandmother's rest, that the calls sometimes came at difficult times, that she had been meaning to establish a better system for ensuring Grandmother got her messages. Said it with the specific helpfulness of someone providing a solution rather than acknowledging a problem. I thanked her and paid closer attention. Over the following months, I began to document. Not formally, just noting dates and details of calls that didn't connect. Visits where access felt managed rather than simply organized. Moments where Grandmother's information about what was happening in the wider family seemed incomplete in ways it hadn't been before Diana moved in. Comments Grandmother made that suggested she believed things about family members that weren't accurate. Small misapprehensions, the kind that form when the primary source of information about people is filtered. I mentioned concerns to my mother. She had her own versions of them. Calls not connecting. Information reaching Grandmother in forms that were slightly wrong. The feeling of a relationship with her own mother being mediated rather than direct. We compared notes, and the pattern that emerged from comparing notes was different from the pattern either of us had been able to see individually. Because individually, each incident was explainable. Together, they had a shape. The shape of something systematic. Not the ordinary adjustments of caring for an elderly person. Something with an architecture. Something that had been built, gradually, carefully, over 2 years, and that had produced a grandmother who was increasingly isolated from the family she had spent her entire life holding together, without anyone having been able to identify the precise moment it had begun. The will was updated 8 months before she died. We didn't know that until the reading, but the timing of the update, set against the timeline of the isolation, said something that the reading of the will had made unmistakable. I gave myself 1 week after the will reading before I did anything. Not because I needed the time to decide whether to act, because acting from the immediate weight of that room would have produced the wrong kind of action. The emotional kind, the confrontational kind, the kind that announces itself before it is ready. And I had learned enough by this point to understand that announcing yourself before you're ready gives the other person the opportunity to prepare. I waited, processed what I had seen in that room, the composure that had told me more than the document had told me. And then I started building the case. Not for court yet, for understanding. I needed to understand precisely what had happened before I could determine what was legally actionable. My lawyer was Mr. Souza, who had become my first call in situations requiring legal clarity. I called him the week after the will reading, described the situation. He listened carefully. Then he said something that gave the investigation a specific direction. He said the relevant legal concept was undue influence, a specific doctrine in inheritance law that addresses situations where a person in a position of power or trust over a vulnerable individual uses that position to influence decisions the individual would not otherwise have made. Not fraud exactly, not forgery, something more nuanced. The exploitation of a relationship of dependency to shape decisions in the influencer's favor. He said the challenge of undue influence cases was evidence that the doctrine was established, that courts took it seriously, but that establishing it required demonstrating the specific conditions, the vulnerability of the person whose will was being influenced, the opportunity for influence through the particular position the influencer occupied, the conduct of the influencer in using that position, and the outcome that the influence had produced. All 4 elements needed to be established clearly. The vulnerability was the easiest. Grandmother had been in her late 80s, in declining health, dependent on Diana for her day-to-day care, living in an environment that Diana managed, that established vulnerability clearly and was likely to be uncontested. The opportunity was also clear. Diana's physical presence, her control of grandmother's access to other family members, her management of the information environment, her presence at appointments, her role as the intermediary between grandmother and the outside world, all of it creating the specific opportunity that the doctrine required. The conduct was where the documentation mattered, and the outcome was the will itself. The 4 elements were present. The question was how clearly we could establish the conduct. I told Mr. Souza about the documentation I had been building, the informal notes of calls that hadn't connected, the pattern of information management, the timeline of the isolation. He said it was a starting point, that we needed more, that we needed witnesses, that we needed specific accounts from people who had experienced the isolation directly, and that we needed to look at the will itself, at the circumstances under which it had been updated, who had been present, what the solicitor who had updated it could say about grandmother's presentation at the time, about whether independent legal advice had been offered, about whether the conditions around the updating of the will had been appropriate. That last element was significant. When a will is updated by an elderly person in declining health while living with someone who stands to benefit substantially from the update, the circumstances of that update are relevant to an undue influence challenge. A solicitor who conducted that update properly would have ensured grandmother was seen independently, without Diana present, would have assessed her capacity, would have been alert to the specific dynamic of a caregiver-beneficiary situation. Mr. Souza said the first step was finding out who had updated the will and what those circumstances had looked like. He made that inquiry. The solicitor who had updated the will had been different from the family's long-standing solicitor, someone Diana had engaged, not someone grandmother had used for decades. Someone new, brought in for this specific purpose. That information landed with a particular weight. Not conclusive, but specific. The grandmother I had known for my entire life had a solicitor she had used for 30 years. The will update had used someone different. Someone whose introduction to grandmother had been managed by Diana. Mr. Souza said we needed to speak to the family's long-standing solicitor, to find out what they knew, to find out if they had been involved, and to find out if they had any concerns about what had happened. What we found in that conversation changed everything. The family's long-standing solicitor was a man named Mr. Pemberton. He had handled grandmother's legal affairs for over 30 years, had known her as a person rather than just a client, had the specific relationship with her that develops across decades of professional contact with someone sharp-minded and clear about what she wanted. Mr. Souza approached him carefully, professionally, through the appropriate channels, explaining the nature of the inquiry, what we were trying to understand, and what we were hoping he might be able to tell us. Mr. Pemberton was thoughtful in his response. He had professional obligations that constrained what he could share, but he also had something else, a concern he had been carrying since before grandmother died. That concern had not produced action at the time, because the action that would have been required was significant, and because the evidence available to him had been insufficient to justify it. But it had existed, and in the context of our inquiry, it became something he felt able to speak to within the limits of what was appropriate. He told us that approximately 2 years after Diana moved in, he had received a call from grandmother, not through Diana, direct, on an afternoon when he happened to be working late. The call had been brief and unusual. Grandmother had asked him a question about the existing will, specifically about whether its terms could be changed without her being physically present with her solicitor. He had told her no, that any update required her direct involvement, that she would need to meet with him, or with any solicitor she chose to work with. She had seemed to receive that clearly, had thanked him, and ended the call. He had thought about the call afterward, about the specific quality of it, the brevity, the nature of the question, the sense that it had been made with some care about not being overheard. He had not acted on what he had observed, because observation of a brief phone call was not sufficient grounds for intervention, and because in the weeks that followed there had been no further contact, no indication that whatever had prompted the call had developed into anything that required response. But he had remembered it, had stored it, in the particular way that professionals store things that don't require action, but that carry the quality of something worth remembering. Mr. Souza asked him to document what he had told us, in the form of a formal statement. Mr. Pemberton agreed, said he had been waiting for someone to ask the question that allowed him to say what he had been thinking since the will reading. The statement he produced was careful, specific, in the measured language of someone who was saying what they knew without overstating it. It described the call, the date, the content, his assessment of its quality, his subsequent reflection on what it might have represented. It did not conclude anything. It described what had happened, and left the conclusion to those who would read it alongside everything else. We gathered statements from other family members, my mother, 2 of grandmother's oldest friends, a cousin who had attempted to visit and had been told on multiple occasions that grandmother was resting or unwell. Each statement describing the isolation from their own experience, the calls that didn't connect, the visits that were managed or discouraged, the information about grandmother that reached them in forms that were slightly wrong, the sense of a relationship being mediated that had previously been direct. Individually, each statement described a personal experience. Together, they described a pattern. The pattern the undue influence doctrine required. We also engaged a medical expert, someone who could speak to grandmother's capacity and vulnerability during the period the will had been updated. The medical records were subpoenaed through the legal process. They showed a picture of a woman in declining health, cognitively capable in many respects, but increasingly dependent, increasingly susceptible to the particular influence that comes from being entirely managed by a single person. The expert's assessment was specific. that the conditions present in the period before the will update created a vulnerability to influence that a person in full independent circumstances would not have had, that the dependency grandmother had on Diana for her daily existence created a specific kind of pressure on her decision-making, not necessarily conscious pressure. The pressure of a person who has come to understand what the person they depend on wants, and who adjusts their decisions accordingly. Not because they're forced, because the dynamics of dependency make resistance significantly more costly than accommodation. That assessment added the final element, the conduct and opportunity established by the witness statements, the vulnerability established by the medical evidence, the outcome established by the will itself, and now the mechanism, how the influence had operated, not through overt coercion, through the slower and more invisible process of dependency shaping decision-making. Mr. Souza said the case was ready, that what we had assembled was as strong as he had hoped it would be, that the elements were present and the evidence supporting each one was specific. We filed and waited for Diana's response. Diana's response came through legal representation within 2 weeks, a firm that specialized in contentious probate matters, which told me something about her preparation. Not a general practice solicitor retained in response to an unexpected challenge. A specialist, which meant she had anticipated the possibility of a challenge, had prepared for it, had legal representation ready to deploy before the proceedings had formally begun. That preparation was itself information, consistent with the composure in the reading room. The picture of someone who had thought carefully about what might follow, and had positioned herself accordingly. Her legal team's initial response was the standard one: denial of the undue influence claim, characterization of the care arrangement as genuine and selfless, presentation of Diana as a devoted granddaughter who had sacrificed significantly to provide care for an elderly woman, who had been rewarded appropriately for that sacrifice by the autonomous and informed decision of the person she had cared for. The language was carefully chosen: autonomous, informed, emphasizing grandmother's agency, positioning any challenge to the will as a challenge to grandmother's own decision, which was a sophisticated framing, because undue influence challenges always have to navigate the respect owed to a testator's expressed wishes. Courts are not quick to overturn wills. The presumption of validity is strong. The evidence required to displace it is specific. Diana's legal team understood that, was framing the case to make the displacement as difficult as possible. Mr. Souza had anticipated this framing. Our response addressed it directly. The challenge was not to grandmother's decision-making capacity in general. It was to the specific conditions under which the decision had been made. The doctrine of undue influence does not require the person to have been incapable. It requires that the influence exerted over them was such that the decision they made was not their free decision, that the relationship of dependency and the conduct of the person exercising influence had produced a result that did not represent the testator's genuine autonomous wishes. The evidence we had assembled addressed exactly that. Mr. Pemberton's statement was central. The call he had described told a specific story. A grandmother who had reached out to her trusted, long-standing solicitor, not to Diana's newly engaged solicitor, asking a question about the existing will, in a way that suggested she was not entirely free in how she was navigating the situation. That call was not conclusive, but it was specific, and it pointed in a direction that the rest of the evidence supported. The witness statements painted a picture of a grandmother who had been progressively isolated from the people she had spent her life maintaining close relationships with, not through her own choice to withdraw, through the management of her environment by the person who controlled her access to the outside world. The medical evidence established the vulnerability that made that management consequential rather than merely inconvenient. The new solicitor who had conducted the will update was contacted through the legal process. His account of the circumstances of the update was reviewed. The specifics of whether grandmother had been seen independently, whether her wishes had been explored in a context free from Diana's influence, whether the alarm bells that should ring for any solicitor conducting a will update for an elderly person in the care of the beneficiary had rung, whether he had taken the appropriate steps to ensure he was recording genuine wishes rather than managed ones. His account did not suggest bad faith on his part. It suggested a professional who had conducted what appeared to be a routine update, who had assessed capacity, who had recorded what his client appeared to want, but who had not been positioned to know what we now knew about the context, about the isolation, about the calls, about the dependency that had been created and managed across 2 years. Mr. Souza presented all of it, the full picture assembled from every source, placed in sequence, each element supporting the others. The cumulative effect of it was a case that the individual elements could not have built alone. Diana's legal team continued to contest. Each submission met with a response. Each attempt to characterize the evidence as insufficient met with the full weight of what we had assembled. The expert's assessment was challenged. Mr. Seuss's response to the challenge demonstrated its limitations. The witness statements were characterized as the grievances of disappointed beneficiaries. Mr. Souza addressed that characterization directly. The statements described specific incidents with specific dates, not grievances, evidence. The process moved forward with the particular momentum of a case built on solid documentary foundations, meeting defensive arguments that were sophisticated but ultimately not supported by equivalent evidence. I watched the process from a distance, through Mr. Seuss's updates, without appearing in it myself beyond what was required, without making statements I wasn't asked to make, without inserting myself into a process that was running correctly without my active involvement. Just patient, waiting for the outcome. The court found in our favor. Not completely. Partially overturning a will is not the same as overturning it entirely. The court's finding was specific, that the evidence established the conditions for undue influence in relation to certain elements of the estate, that the isolation of grandmother from other family members during the period preceding the will update had been documented to a standard the court found persuasive, that the circumstances under which the update had been conducted had not been sufficient to protect against the influence that the evidence suggested had been operating, that Mr. Pemberton's account of the call was particularly significant. A woman reaching out to her trusted, long-standing solicitor, asking a specific question about whether her will could be changed without her direct involvement, in circumstances that suggested she was managing that inquiry carefully. The court found that call to be consistent with someone who was aware of a pressure she was navigating, and who was seeking to understand her position, not the call of a woman freely and contentedly making the arrangements she wanted to make. The elements of the estate most clearly connected to grandmother's long-standing expressed intentions were redistributed. The house remained with Diana. The court did not find sufficient grounds to overturn that element entirely. But the financial assets, the investments, the specific items grandmother had described over the years to specific family members, those were addressed. The redistribution was not everything we had sought. It was what the evidence most clearly supported, and it was significant. The family received what grandmother had spent years communicating was her intention. The grandfather's watch came to me, the furniture to my cousin, the jewelry to my mother, the items that carried the specific meaning grandmother had attached to them, returned to the people she had always intended them for. In the language the court had used to describe the finding, not Diana's language, grandmother's. Diana's image was the part that collapsed most completely, and I want to describe that carefully, because the collapse was not something I had engineered. It was something the process had produced. The evidence presented in the proceedings became visible to the family. Not all of it immediately, but the shape of it, the pattern of calls not connecting, the managed visits, the isolation that had accumulated across 2 years. The new solicitor brought in to update a will that the long-standing solicitor of 30 years had not been involved in. The composure in the reading room that people remembered differently once they understood what it had reflected. Family members who had called Diana selfless, who had expressed gratitude for the sacrifice she had appeared to make, who had spoken warmly of her commitment to grandmother's care, now held a different picture, not constructed by me, produced by the evidence that the process had required to be assembled and presented. Diana had built an image over 3 years. The devoted caregiver, the granddaughter who had given up elements of her own life to be present for someone who needed her. That image had served her well, had produced a trust that had allowed the isolation to develop unquestioned, had created the social permission for the access and control she had exercised. The image had been the mechanism, and the proceedings had examined the mechanism in detail, in front of people who had trusted the image completely. I don't know how Diana lives with what happened. That is not something I have access to, and not something I spend time trying to understand. She had made a series of choices across 3 years. Those choices had been examined, found to have operated in a specific way, and the consequences of that finding had followed. What she did with those consequences was hers to manage. I thought about grandmother throughout the process, not with grief primarily, with the particular clarity that comes from understanding someone more completely after they are gone than you had while they were present, because the process had produced information about those final years that I hadn't had access to before, about the call to Mr. Pemberton, about the specific question she had asked, about what that question suggested she had been navigating. She had not been passive in her situation. She had reached out, had tried to understand her position, had looked for a way to understand what her options were. That mattered to me. The image of a grandmother who had been entirely managed, who had simply been moved by forces around her, was not accurate. She had been aware, had been navigating something difficult, in the reduced circumstances of someone dependent on the person she was navigating against. And she had made a call to her trusted solicitor, which had become part of the evidence that partially restored what she had intended. There is something in that which I find worth holding. Not triumphant, just true. She had not been entirely without agency in those final years. She had done what she could with what was available to her. And what she had done had mattered, had been remembered, had been documented, had become the specific piece of evidence that the court had found most significant. I received the grandfather's watch on a Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Seuss's office, handed over as part of the formal redistribution. I held it for a moment before putting it in my pocket, thought about the years she had told me it would be mine, the specific certainty with which she had said it, the way she spoke about the things she intended to leave, as if their destination was simply a fact that would eventually become current. She had been right about where they belonged. She had just needed someone to ensure they got there. Some people mistake devotion for an opportunity. The evidence they leave behind in doing so is usually enough to correct that mistake in the end. If this story resonated with you, the patience of building the case, the importance of the right legal framework at the right moment, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.